Okay, folks, this is Tragedy and Hope, the book study, part 8. And we're going to start with a couple of PowerPoint slides real quickly to get us up and running and get us into the lesson. Okay, Quigley says that you have to get a understanding of a complex civilization society, you have to break it up to get a lower level understanding and then build it up from there. So what he divided a culture or a civilization into what he calls six parts, six cultural parts. Uh, he calls the six aspects of a society. Um, because it's your military, which is basically your security, your military, your political, which is organization, economic, that's self-explanatory, your economic system, your social, which is your culture, your cultural rules, religious, and intellectual. Those are his six aspects of society, and later on, in later lessons, but later on in the chapter, he breaks these down into their components so we can get a lower level or a baseline level of understanding of how of these particular aspects, but also how they integrate and affect civilizations and societies in particular. Okay, well, he starts with something that's very critical, key and critical. He calls it the organization of power, or as he says, how civilizations or societies um, gain consent. And he says there's only three basic ways of doing it. And you can see the three ways. And I added, something that we always hear. We hear about power, hard and soft. We hear about China using its soft power to gain an edge with other countries. Here we're going to add that third column to kind of give you what's the difference between hard power and soft power. Okay, there's only three methods. Okay, that which force, which is basically your military or your paramilitary, which is your police, and we call that hard power. Somebody puts a gun to your head, you don't have a choice. You do what you're told. Okay, the second method is economic. It's buying consent with wealth. Giving them welfare, giving somebody a job, allowing them to gain a business, trade, loans, that kind of stuff. That's economic. That's buying them consent with wealth. You're actually paying them, or you're giving them a boost up for a better life, and that's economic. And we consider that soft power. Chinese do that very well with loans, with building up infrastructure, and that's the economic wealth of a country is being built up, and China gains consent by doing that. That's how they get their trade deals. The third one, and the last one, which is a little bit more nebulous, is a little harder to explain, is by persuasion. That's ideological. That's intellectual. The feminist movement, the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement. Those are intellectual. Those have to do with something that you can't explain. Let's get into the hearts and minds of people. Which that goes along with soft power. If you can give them a better life, that opens them up to the intellectual soft power, which is persuasion. He's gonna get into that a little bit more when he talks about when you have to span countries or span language or what they call it, ethnic blocks. You have to do with ideological blocks, and that's where persuasion comes into it. Okay, here he starts with the military level, and we're gonna briefly go over this, but we're gonna add a video that goes into it a little bit more and give you a little background, and Um, so that like I say, you can give you a real world example to what he's highlighted on the text. But to give a brief example, he says, when weapons were cheap and to get and so easy to use, and anyone could use them. After a short period of training, the armies were generally made up of large mass armies of amateur soldiers, and such weapons we called amateur weapons. And said by a period where weapons were expensive and required long trainings, and to use such weapons we call specialist weapons. So there's a difference. There's the specialist weapons, which take a lot of training and are very hard to use. You have to have a lot of experts to do it. So and they call those professional soldiers. We have a professional soldier class here in the United States. They're not drafted. They're not, when you draft people, those are citizen soldiers. But when you enlist and you have a long period of training, they become specialists and professional soldiers. In a period of specialist weapons, the minority who have such weapons can usually force the majority who lack to obey them, so they can get compliance or obedience by force. Remember the three rules of compliance. Thus, a period of specialist weapons tends to give rise to a period of minority rule and authoritarian government. But a period of amateur weapons is a period in which all men are roughly equal in power, and the majority can compel a minority to yield, and majority rule or even democratic rule tends to rise. The shift from the professional armies of mercenaries to the mass army of citizen soldiers, along with other factors acting on levels of culture, made it necessary to broaden the basis of allegiance. Once again, after 1800, the new basis was nationalism and gave rise to the national state as a typical political unit of the 19th century. So you can see how technology or industrialism affects the political basis, where dynasties start to fall because they can no longer force compliance, or the minority can no longer force compliance on the majority.
He says, for example, that the only times liberties ever appeared in human society is when the population is privately armed with deadly weapons. And to reach the acme of liberty, they have to have the same weapons available to them that the government has available to them. And yet we're not talking about some guy who rolls his collar up. We're talking about this internationally famous scholar. So,
well, at the beginning, the American Revolution, the people who were fighting against the British government had equal arms. They were landowners. They had interest to fight over it. That stopped being equal in the 1930s with mechanized warfare and mass production, because they've had Prussian education in place for 80 years, and now everyone's an obedient worker, and Amtssprache allows a lot of people to do things that they normally wouldn't do, but now it's part of their job, and now it's their responsibility, and now it's their duty, and all the things that Milgram drove home through his experiments. Look, these people will kill other people if you put a white coat on.
Yes.
This is a very important conversation, and hopefully it'll arm you with certain kind of knowledge about what the elite, what the central planners think about weapons. And maybe it'll also help you better understand why they are moving so rapidly and so furiously to redefine certain weapons as assault weapons or as military-grade weapons. It's called Tragedy and Hope. It's this book by Carroll Quigley. Now, admittedly, I haven't read the whole thing. I'm working my way through it. It's 1,300 pages long. Now, the book, it's quite incredible, actually. Very complex, multidimensional, and interdisciplinary. Carroll Quigley writes in the book, in the section called The Organization of Power, quote, by the organization of power in a society, we mean the ways in which obedience and consent or acquiescence are obtained. The close relationship between levels can be seen from the fact that there are three basic ways to win obedience: by force, by buying consent with wealth, and by persuasion. He continues, he says, when weapons are cheap to get and so easy to use that almost anyone can use them after a short period of training, armies are generally made up of large masses of amateur soldiers. Such weapons we call amateur weapons, and such armies we might call mass armies of citizen soldiers. All right, so think about that for a second. So when weapons are readily available, the military power lies in the hands of the citizen soldier. Okay, we got that. But Quigley continues, when weapons were expensive and required long training in their use, such weapons we call specialist weapons. Periods of specialist weapons are generally periods of small armies of professional soldiers, usually mercenaries. In a period of specialist weapons, the minority who has such weapons can usually force the majority who lack them to obey. Thus, a period of specialist weapons tends to give rise to a period of minority rule and authoritarian government.
We have as a basis for action that we take a congressional statute that allows us to operate against al-Qaeda and associated entities, not only in Pakistan or not only in Afghanistan, but in other parts of the world. We say that we only take these kinds of actions when there's an imminent threat, when capture is not feasible, and when we are confident that we're doing so in a way that's consistent with federal and international law. I mean, as I said, I think we laid it out, I think, fairly well.
Now, think about that. Right now in this country, there's a movement by some people to label semi-automatic rifles, quote, specialist weapons, by using the term military grade or even labeling them assault weapons. Who are some of these people? I don't know.
Military assault weapons should be in the hands of the military. And if you need a 100-round clip to put in your military weapon to go out and shoot a deer, maybe you ought to stick to fishing. 100-round magazine clip. Why in the world does anyone other than someone in the military need that? I don't see a legitimate sporting or hunting purpose to an assault rifle or to a 100-round clip. I just don't see it.
Does the Second Amendment have anything to do with hunting?
Of course it does. And read the opinion. And the U.S. Supreme Court was clear in their opinion. Congress still retains the right to monitor and to regulate Second Amendment usage.
And by doing so, they essentially are making these specialist weapons. I want you to really understand. Think about the implication of that, okay? So right now, there's a movement in this country by some people to label semi-automatic rifles specialist weapons by using them, the term military grade, or even labeling them assault weapons.
We must prohibit the sale of assault weapons and high-capacity ammunition magazines in Illinois. Of course, we must abide by the Second Amendment, but there is no place in our state for military-style assault weapons designed for rapid fire at human targets at close range.
But let's continue, shall we? Reading again from Carroll Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope. He says, a period of amateur weapons, as opposed to specialist weapons, a period of amateur weapons is a period in which all men are roughly equal in military power. A majority can compel a minority to yield. And majority rule, or even democratic governments, tend to rise. That right there is a kill shot sniper bullet right through the temple of tyranny. Let's read that one more time. A period in which all men are roughly equal in military power, a majority can compel a minority to yield, and a majority rule or even democratic government tends to rise.